multi-word expressions, or chunks, if you like. And language, any language, not just English, but all languages abound with all kinds of chunks or multi-word expressions or lexical phrases. And you could categorize them. You have those word partnerships or collocations, like we say make a mistake in English. We don't say do a mistake, for example. Idioms, phrasal verbs, similes, binomials, those are those A and B kind of expressions. Prepositional phrases, formulas that you use in conversation, like how are you doing, etc., etc., and compounds. So there's a large class of lexical phrases, and language, authentic natural language, really abounds with these. Just to illustrate this, this is a BBC Radio 4 program that I transcribed many years ago when I was still an EFL teacher back in Belgium. And the idea was, well, I'm going to bring some authentic discourse to my classrooms. Only afterwards did I realize that any kind of piece like this, any kind of authentic discourse, abounds with chunks or lexical phrases. When I asked my native speaker colleagues to read this text and to identify what to them were kind of conventional word combinations or phrases, the result was typically something like this. All these parts in red, they identified as, well, these are typical conventional expressions in English. This is about 50% of discourse. And corpus linguistics seems to suggest that indeed a lot of discourse in any language is very chunky, so phraseological. These chunks, these expressions make language predictable. If you master the language, then that makes discourse predictable and easy to process. So these knowledge of such phrases is very useful for language learners because it helps fluency, receptive fluency and productive fluency. If, for example, you start reading or hearing a phrase like as a matter of, you can predict what's going to follow, as a matter of fact. Last but not least, she's as cold as ice. So language is predictable thanks to phraseology. If you master the phraseology of the language, it becomes much easier to process. We know from psycholinguistics research that if you have good command of chunks, you are also a more fluent speaker because you don't need to kind of retrieve words from memory, you retrieve phrases from memory. And so a lot of your discourse becomes predictable. And because you process language as chunks, you create kind of mental space or cognitive space to fill up the blanks between those chunks with more creative language. Another reason why knowledge of lexical phrases is so useful is because it aids comprehension. Some chunks are very transparent, like make a mistake is transparent, but you also have expressions like idioms and phrasal verbs, right? And idioms, as you may know, are expressions whose meaning is hard to infer from the words. So cut corners, yeah, you may understand cut and corners, doesn't mean you understand the expression to cut corners. To jump the gun, you may understand jump and gun. That doesn't mean you understand jump the gun means doing something too soon. Right? And so research shows that indeed knowledge of idioms matters for text comprehension because texts are very likely to contain idioms or phrasal verbs. Research by Jeanette, whom you listened to earlier today, has also demonstrated that international students at universities in the UK, for example, they very often misunderstand their lectures because they use idioms, they use metaphors. Right? Her research actually suggests that about 80% of misunderstanding of the university's lectures were due to metaphor and idiom. So it's really crucial for language learners to master this dimension of language. It is also vital because knowing those lexical phrases adds to your expressive repertoire. It adds to your productive knowledge of lexis, of vocabulary. We often read about lexical richness. Lexical richness you could divide into two components. Lexical richness on one hand is diversity, means how many words, how many different words you use in discourse. There's also sophistication, which means how many infrequent or uncommon words you use in discourse. And this applies to words, but it also applies to expressions. So something like to make a suggestion is a common phrase, right? And so you can have make a suggestion, make a proposal, etc. And you can diversify your language. That belongs to diversity. But you can also have many more phrases on the sophistication side, and I'll demonstrate what kind of phrases they are, such as, say, wreak havoc. Right? To wreak havoc is another way of saying to cause a lot of damage. Cause damage, you can use cause with lots of different words, but wreak only goes with havoc, for example. This is kind of a combination is very strongly together. There is this very strong bond between those two, and it gives the impression that you are a very advanced language learner. Same with commit atrocities. Spain is not densely populated, Toronto is. COVID-19 was highly contagious. So you have those expressions that are strongly bonded. Those words really seek each other's company, but they include something sophisticated. Right? Research has shown that there's very strong correlations, associations between the phrasal richness of learner discourse and the grades they get on high-stakes exams. So if you teach those kinds of chunks to your language learners, you give them an advantage and they score well in high-stakes exams like IELTS tests, for example. This has been demonstrated for speaking tasks, for writing tasks, and it is especially those sophisticated ones that matter. An additional component or dimension is that many words in a language are polysemous. They have more than one meaning, right? And polysemy and phraseology go hand in hand. They are two sides of the same coin, so to speak. If you take, say, a verb like to run, the literal meaning of run occurs in to run a marathon, to run fast, to run along the street, to run after someone. Right? So run in those combinations can combine with just about anything. But if you have lexical phrases, like you can run a bath, right? You can run a business, you can run risks, you can run an errand. Kamala Harris is running for office, right? So in all these lexical phrases, in all these kind of idioms, so to speak, run is no longer used as bipedal motion, right? So in all those expressions, run is used metaphorically. And so that's why non-literal senses, so metaphorical use of words, also contribute to proficiency. This has been shown, for example, in a study by a former PhD student of mine back in New Zealand, and I think it was Jeanette who referred to it as well. So this PhD student collected essays from EFL learners in Vietnam, and she had those essays graded by experienced assessors. And then we counted the metaphoricity in those essays, how often the students used metaphorical words. And we found a very strong correlation between their use of metaphor and the grades that they would get from their experienced assessors, the graders, right? The correlation was 0.71. That's a very, very strong correlation. Which then suggests to me that phrasal sophistication, which I referred to earlier, is not just a matter of having those strong word partnerships with non-frequent words, but it's especially those strong word partnerships with non-frequent words where those words are used in a metaphorical way. It's probably that combination that makes a big difference. So if you teach your language students to use those kinds of expressions, you give them an advantage in high-stakes tests, for example. They will come across as high proficiency learners. Okay? Now, important thing to note is that it's not just any kind of metaphorical word use. We saw that if students used those expressions in a way that was grammatically wrong, then of course the correlation goes down, right? And it is very easy to get these things wrong. So in English, you can say there is no doubt about it. That's conventional. You can't say there are no doubts about it, but there's no rule that tells you so. And so we noticed that if students used expressions like this, but in an ungrammatical way, then of course the grades went down too. So it's not just a matter of lexical richness and sophistication, you have to get it right at the same time. So it's pretty challenging for language learners. The same thing with an idiom like to play it by ear, that's correct, but to play it by the ear is not correct in English. In English, there's an expression to bite someone's head off, which means that you snap at someone, you're very angry, right? In my mother tongue, Dutch, and also in French, I don't know about Spanish, it is actually biting someone's nose off. It's the same idea, but it's different lexical composition. And so you can imagine that if a language user produces something like she almost bit my nose off, then for a language teacher, it's going to be puzzling. Is this creative metaphor use, or is this just L1 transfer? And so there's this kind of competition between, do you interpret language as being creative metaphor or as deviant from the norm? And so my suggestion would be is to, if you want to instill creativity in metaphor use in your students, teach them some strategies to signal that they're actually intentionally using the metaphor creatively. Like turning to a simile, for example, it is a bit like, and then you signal, well, I'm using it creatively, and so you don't get penalized, essentially. And of course, teachers need to be more appreciative of creative language. And the teachers may need to say, well, actually, I understand this. She almost bit my nose off, so it's fine. But in our data, we notice that, for example, IELTS assessors are very kind of negative about this kind of deviant use of conventional metaphor. There's work to be done. Anyway, so knowledge of lexical phrases is important. I hope I've illustrated that. The next question is, what can teachers do to help students master them, right? Various things. And so what I'll be talking about is a number of possible pedagogical interventions, and I'll evaluate how efficient they really are based on the research. Essentially, there's 4 broad categories of interventions. You can give students exercises. You can give students texts in which you make certain phrases stand out so they notice them. You can use mnemonic tricks. And you can also simply tell students that it's important for them to collect lexical phrases from discourse. And I'll illustrate all 4 strands. Let's start with exercises. Over the past number of years, I have analyzed lots of EFL textbooks, those mainstream textbooks that are published for an international readership, all money-making machines, right? Yeah. And you would expect those textbooks to know what they're doing. And so one of the things that I noticed, if you look at exercises, that very often these exercises ask students to make choices between what is right and what is wrong. You recognize these kinds of exercises? Yeah. Language courses are full of these kinds of things. Yeah? And they come in different formats. So you can also ask, well, underline the correct alternative. Yeah? Or you have things like finding a mistake. So you present students with wrong sentences and you ask them to find mistakes. In this case, it is some of the sentences have a mistake, not all of them, which may be additionally confusing. Find the wrong word in each sentence and correct it. These are very common exercise formats in standard mainstream textbooks. In fact, these formats are tests. They are multiple choice tests. And so these textbook authors very often use test formats as exercises. And these are essentially choosing between what is right and what is wrong, so are multiple choice tests. We call these selected response tests. So you give students a number of options, some are wrong, some are correct, and they have to select what is right. Or they are essentially what we call in the research grammaticality judgment tests. You present students with sentences that contain a mistake, and you have to find a mistake. These are typically test formats in countries where they use high-stakes tests to get into university, for example. But are they good exercises? Is it really wise to ask students to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong? I've done some counting in these textbooks. So in New Total English, for example, which is one of those best-selling textbooks, 24% of the exercises ask students to find and correct mistakes, and 27% are kind of multiple choice exercises. If you add these two up, it means that students are exposed to more wrong English than correct English. Does that make sense? As you may know, many of those books also come with a so-called workbook. So you have the student book that you use in the classroom, and you have the workbook that's used as homework, right? Just the name workbook. Ugh. Anyway, so in the workbook as well, you find that over 50% of these kinds of exercises expose students to wrong English. And then we expect students to forget about all those wrong examples. And of course, these textbook authors write those books for a global market. They don't know what the typical mistakes are that are going to be made by students in different countries, right? So they make up mistakes that might never have occurred to the students who are using those books. And then you expect the students to forget those mistakes. Essentially, you plant the seeds of evil, right? And then you hope the students will forget. So this is a general observation, but we are talking about lexical phrases. Well, you find the same thing for those lexical phrases in textbooks. And so what we find is that very often these exercises require students to kind of reassemble broken up expressions, putting a verb and a noun back together. And very often they use the exercise to introduce knowledge. So they use an exercise to make students aware that they don't know something yet. And then you expect them to learn from the feedback or from the answer key or whatever. Very often those expressions, like those collocations, don't occur in the previous pages at all. Okay? So essentially what these textbooks do is they engage students in trial and error, and then they give the answer key. And so typical formats there are, you have, say, a bank of options from the top of the page, and then you have a gap fill, and you've kind of match, right? You've all done these exercises. Yeah? Me too. So these kinds of exercise formats have been around for decades and decades and decades. I had those in my high school days as well, and that's quite a while ago. All kind of, choose between what is right and what is wrong. Underline the correct verb. Or a matching exercise. Or find the odd one out. One word in each group does not make a strong word partnership, which is the odd one out. And you can imagine a diligent student going through the list, right? To do damage, to do harm, to do a favor, to do a breakthrough, to do homework, to do, I don't know. Okay, again, to do damage, to do harm. And then you say, oh, it is not to do a breakthrough, it is to make a breakthrough. In the meantime, the student has probably imagined do a breakthrough a couple of times, and then the student is supposed to forget it. So how well do these exercises work? Well, we imitated those exercises in a typical research design. So we gave students in ESL classrooms, this was back in New Zealand, a pre-test first on those word partnerships, on collocations. Then a couple of weeks later, they were given an exercise of the type that I've just shown. They received the answer key. We asked them to make corrections on their worksheet. And then a couple of weeks later, we gave them the same exercise again to see how much they learned. And so the test format was something like a gap fill exercise like this. Very often these are kind of autobiographically inspired. My husband just pretends to pay attention. So how well does that work? So altogether, we did this 20 times with different kinds of exercise formats, different populations of students. And so what is the average learning gain from pre-test to post-test? 16%. That's a waste of time, right? It's a waste of time. And we are not the only ones who find this. There's other studies that also show that it's really a very, very minimal learning that you get from these kinds of exercises. Now, why don't they work any better than this? But one reason may be that these exercises are so shallow, right? They are not engaging, they are boring exercises. And so maybe students do the exercise and then forget straight away, which then means that the exercise is a waste of time. At least it's harmless. You keep your students busy, right? On the other hand, maybe these exercises actually cause confusion, in which case they are potentially harmful. And what we found was that if we looked at the responses of the students on their worksheets, we noticed that sometimes on the pre-test, they got it right. Like they would say to take an approach to something or to keep a watch on the children. But then in the exercise, they would be confronted with other options, which would destabilize their prior knowledge. In the post-test, they would get it wrong. And so you get some unlearning. So now, of course, this may also be a coincidence. Maybe they were guessing at the pre-test. You can guess, right? It can be a lucky guess. And then they just didn't remember the exercise, and they guessed again in the post-test and got it wrong. So this is just based on worksheets. What we wanted to do was really investigate whether these exercises actually cause confusion. Do those distractors, the wrong options in the exercise, linger in memory and interfere with recall of the correct option afterwards? And so I asked one of my MA students, Alisa Lee, to do this. And I asked her, well, you recruit 20 ESL students at our faculty in Canada. We give them exercise on 20 verb noun collocations. You are going to be with each student individually to make sure they stay on task, and you ask them to think aloud while they do the exercise. And then a week later, you're going to give them the same exercise again, and again ask them to think aloud. And so the exercise was a multiple choice exercise. And so the students were asked, okay, while you do the exercise on paper, just tell me if you already know the expression. Tell me if you're just guessing. Tell me if you're hesitating between options and so on. And after those 20 items, the students were given the correct answers and they were asked to make corrections. And then in meeting 2, 1 week later, they were given exactly the same exercise and they were asked to, again, think aloud. And Alisa asked them, well, can you remember this item? Can you remember what your response was last week? Can you remember if your response was correct? Can you actually remember which of the verbs is correct? So most of the items the students didn't know yet, so let's focus on those first. So did the students actually remember the exercise items? Yeah, for 66%. Which means that for the other 33%, they'd forgotten totally, right? Did they remember the correct answer? Yes, for 38 of those. For 41%, they said, well, I would have to guess again. I can't remember. For 21%, they were convinced that one of the wrong options was the correct one. What's worse, the students already knew some of the collocations beforehand because they told us, yeah, this one I already know, and they got it right. Okay. For these, for 20%, they were no longer sure. They didn't know anymore. So the exercise destabilized their prior knowledge. So the morality here is don't follow the textbook. Okay. Now, Alisa has now moved on to the PhD, and she's doing other kinds of research where she's comparing multiple choice exercises to other kinds of exercises. That's a follow-up story. Anyway, some takeaways is these selected response formats can be problematic, right? Especially if you are introducing confusable items. Multiple choice is a test format. It's not a learning format. So try to distinguish between the two. Now, we know that these textbooks won't change, right? Textbook authors don't read any research. They just want to make money, right? And so textbooks won't change. They will keep using those kinds of exercises. So if teachers really need to use them, then maybe it's best not to kind of ask students to reassemble expressions, but keep the expressions intact. And this is something we also tried years ago. Instead of giving just the verbs, give them the whole expression and then fill in the whole expression in the blanks. So that reduces the risk of kind of mixing up those combinations. Right? Also, use the exercise as retrieval practice. So remember, these exercises are often used as trial and error to introduce new knowledge. You can use exercises to have students practice what they have already learned. And this was illustrated by another PhD student of mine with phrasal verbs. This was a study done in Japan. This was Brian Strong's PhD. He taught Japanese EFL students phrasal verbs. One group did it in a trial and error way. So they were first given a gap fill exercise. A dialogue, hey, Yuki, if you're not busy after work, do you want to hang out? In the other group, the students were first asked to read what hang out means. And then in the next stage, for the trial and error condition, there was the feedback. Yes, hang out means to spend time with friends. In the study and retrieval condition, that's where they were asked to kind of recall from memory. Which of these two do you think is most effective? Absolutely. So in the post-test, where we asked the students to kind of, again, reproduce the phrasal verbs, we found that the study episode followed by retrieval is more effective. Interestingly, in the trial and error condition, 25% of the mistakes made by the students in the post-test were the same mistakes they made in the exercise. Memory is a strange thing. We don't learn so much from our mistakes. We think we learn from our mistakes, but we don't. Now, if retrieval is better, then how do we present those phrases intact first before we do something else with them? Well, simple. Use authentic discourse and point out useful phrases in discourse, but they are intact, right? So we're at this kind of intervention now. And this is a very simple intervention. Something you can use is typographic enhancement, right? You take the existing text and you make certain phrases that you find interesting stand out so students will notice them. So like in the text I used earlier on, if you can just highlight some of the expressions, that's a way for students to notice them. You can't highlight too much, because the more you highlight, the more you defeat the purpose. If you highlight half of the text, then nothing stands out anymore, obviously. So this seems to work rather well, because here's a study by a couple of researchers whom I know quite well. They used this technique with students in Vietnam, EFL students in Vietnam, and they read stories spread over 9 weeks. And for some students, collocations, expressions were enhanced. For other students, they were not enhanced. And then they were given a test after those 9 weeks. And they found that actually, if the phrases had not been enhanced, the learning was very minimal. Even when the phrases had been enhanced, there was promising gain. Very simple, no time investment really, because they're reading stories for fun. No exercises, no boring exercise, and you get some learning. 36% is okay. Can we do more? Can we make phrases more memorable, for example? We can. There's two broad ways of doing this. One way is to engage students with the composition, the lexical makeup of phrases. And there's one very simple technique for English. I'm going to show you a couple of expressions here, like time will tell. It's a slippery slope. To cut corners. She's a busy bee. Better safe than sorry. What do all these phrases illustrate? Alliteration. English is a champion of alliteration. You also have, of course, rhyme, to steer clear of something, to take a break, the brain drain, etc. Rhyme and assonance. We know from research that if you point out these patterns to students, it makes phrases more memorable. They can remember the phrases much better. And again, it doesn't take much time. So we've published various studies about this. Simply directing students' attention to such patterns helps them to remember the phrases. Doesn't take as much time as a boring exercise. Just point it out to them. Now you might say, well, alliteration and rhyme are rare. They aren't rare in English. So people like myself who are a bit weird, because we are linguists, we count things in dictionaries. 20% of idioms alliterate. In a general dictionary, about 12% of multi-word entries in a dictionary alliterate. That's highly significant. So I now have a new expression, words of a feather flock together. So the original is, of course, birds of a feather flock together. So I'm using creative metaphor. And so it's alliteration across the board, right? So it's everywhere. It's everywhere. You have them in those binomial phrases quite a bit. You have them in similes. In those kinds of expressions, it's over 30%. And it's very often just the sound pattern that motivates the expression. Take cool as a cucumber. Is a cucumber really cool? Not really, eh? And if you still don't believe me, then just read Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter, 1/3 of the fictitious characters in Harry Potter alliterate. And it's a tradition in English. Disney character names, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Peter Pan. Movie titles, Guardians of the Galaxy, Fast and the Furious. Why don't we say Guardians of the Universe or something, right? It's a long tradition. Okay. And the same thing with rhyme and near rhyme. So again, we can count these. And again, the instances of rhyme in language are statistically significant. And again, if you point them out to students, they remember those expressions better. Interestingly, if you don't point them out, students will not notice. Because when we process language, we process content. We don't process the packaging of the content. So our research shows if you point them out, they remember. If you don't point them out, they don't remember. One last thing I'll illustrate for what you can do to make phrases more memorable is using imagery. And that's something that Anna and I have worked on quite a bit as well. Many years ago, my colleagues back in Belgium created a learning procedure for our advanced students of English to learn idioms. And we created a kind of online exercise procedure. We would present students with an idiom like to throw in the towel, and we would teach them where it comes from, what the origin is. To throw in the towel is originally from boxing, right? So when your boxer is losing, you as a coach, you throw in the towel to signal defeat. Or to go out on a limb, we would kind of explain that a limb here is actually not a limb of the body, it's a branch of a tree. If, say, a squirrel goes out on a limb, it's in danger, right? It might be caught by a bird of prey, for example. And then we would ask the students, okay, what do you think the real meaning is of these expressions, like throw in the towel? And that would be a multiple choice. If you remember the origin of throw in the towel, then this is easy, right? And students always got it right. And they make it feel good, right? Or with the out on a limb, go out on a limb, yeah, it means that you put yourself at risk, easy. And students made a connection between the image of a concrete scene and the metaphorical meaning. And then afterwards, we tested them, right? So we tested them. Can you remember the keyword of the expression? Like some of the classes, of course, were very hard. I was ready to throw in the towel, to give up. By starting a business on your own, you are going out on a limb, etc., etc. So we use this procedure in lots of trials again. We presented students with very long sets of idioms to make it very challenging for them. And then we tested them after a week. On average, we got a 77% success rate, which is, compared to those exercises that we talked about earlier, is a little bit better, right? Some good news. Okay. And you can, of course, use real images too, which is something that Anna and I did years ago. You can add some pictures, real pictures, instead of just relying on mental imagery. One last thing I would like to just mention is that activities like output-oriented activities don't need to be boring exercises like multiple choice. Something a good friend of mine came up with years ago, said Lindstromberg, was, well, why don't we first teach a number of expressions and then ask students to integrate those expressions in their own creative writing? So here's something that I would like you to consider. So here's the prompt. Invent a short story about two people, Bill and Kate, and their relationship. You can write in pairs. In your story, please incorporate the following phrases that you have just learned and try to create your story without looking at the list. Try to retrieve them from memory. And here are the phrases that we came up with. Fall in love, hit it off, pop the question, get cold feet, and so on. These were specifically chosen so they fit a romantic relationship. And so you can imagine a story about, yeah, so Bill and Kate, they start hanging out together and they hit it off and, oh, they fall in love. And so, yeah, maybe Bill pops the question, proposes. And then, oh, something happens. Someone starts seeing somebody else or gets cold feet. And somebody else is in tears and says, never again will I fall in love. Right? I tried this exercise with my students back in Belgium several times. And so the seeing someone else. In all those stories, can you guess who started seeing someone else, Bill or Kate? In those days, it was always Bill, right? Which was then kind of a signal for me to tell students a little bit about sexism and say, well, actually, there's no difference in promiscuity between males and females. So rewrite the story, please. Yeah. Okay. All right. So something I keep telling a lot of my research students now is that when you do research, you typically try to isolate the effect of one variable. That's what the researchers do. Language teachers use a bag of tricks. And so my current approach to research is you need to kind of look at the effects of an ensemble, a package of activities, and then compare. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. I'm going to leave you with one last thing. This was the last question that I was going to answer. Can we foster learner autonomy? Does it make a difference if you train your students to look for chunks, lexical phrases in the text that they use in their course? Are they going to then be inclined to look for similar phrases outside the language classroom or in other courses? The answer simply is, and you can read about this study. This was a study that was published recently in the Modern Language Journal, where we trained students in Vietnam to read texts first for the content, and then again to identify useful lexical phrases. We asked them to check dictionaries, online dictionaries, to make sure they were actual lexical phrases. And we did this for 10 weeks, one lesson per week. And then 5 months later, we collected their essays that were written in other courses, totally unrelated to this intervention. And what we found was we had an experimental group where we had this kind of training. We had a comparison group where we didn't do the training, but they used the same texts, but they discussed the text for content. And we asked, well, if we then collect essays that the students write for other courses, totally unconnected, and if we compare the lexical phrases that the students use in those two sets of essays, are we going to find a difference? And is the difference going to be about lexical phrases which were not in those course texts, right? Are they going to pick up more lexical phrases from outside that course? And what we found was, I'm going to sit this up. An essay they wrote before the intervention, no difference in the lexical expressions. At the end of their term, the experimental group used many more lexical phrases, not from the course, but from elsewhere than the comparison group. And this was maintained 5 months later. So you can create a language awareness in your students that are going to transfer beyond your single EFL class. So there is evidence that you can create an effect for learner autonomous acquisition of lexical phrases. And remember what I said about lexical sophistication? It was not just more lexical phrases, but better ones. So these are some of the collocations used by the experimental group. All highly sophisticated. They still made lots of mistakes, though. So even the experimental group would combine words in a non-conventional way. But it was better than the comparison group. In the comparison group, there were lots of mistakes. There was improvement in quantity and in quality. Okay, I'll leave it here. So these are the recommendations for practice. Fostering learner autonomy, improving the chance of uptake from texts, enhancement, for example, making phrases memorable, those techniques like alliteration just pointed out, or linking idioms to their origins helps. And then retrieval practice. So have them integrate newly learned phrases in their own output. Ideally, have them retrieve those phrases from memory if they can, because every time you retrieve something from memory, the stronger the memory gets. And here's some review articles that you might want. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very pedagogical talk, as well as enlightening and, of course, scientific, with lots of food for thought again. Are there any questions in the audience, particularly in the online audience? I see lots of clapping, but...
Thank you.
Yes, Laura, sorry. Can you use the mic so that the people at home can listen to you, Laura?
Thank you. That was very interesting. I wonder if you have any experience, apart from training the students, which is our principal concern, training the teachers. I was taught at some point in my career that if a student uses something more sophisticated, but they use it wrongly, it's called reach, and you give them the points for the reach. You don't penalize, but I wonder how much work we do training teachers as well.
Excellent question. And I think teachers need to be much more tolerant. Much more tolerant of, not mistakes, but where the learner language deviates a little bit from the norm. Because what is the norm, right? You're still talking about the native speaker norm. And with increasing language contact, the language is changing as well, right? And so it's interesting that still a lot of high stakes testing, like IELTS testing and so on, still focuses a lot on accuracy rather than actual communicative effectiveness. And it's a bit strange in that regard that so many textbooks as well have all those exercises that really focus on the correct word combinations and so on. I mean, if I say, I've done a good effort, instead of I've made a good effort, you understand me, right? And yet, in exams, it's going to be penalized. And so I think teachers, but also assessors of learner language should focus much more on communicative effectiveness than on accuracy. But it is, of course, the case that sometimes you can express yourself much better with a sophisticated, specific term than with a very general term, like give me that thing, right? Give me that thing is not very communicatively effective. But it's more the communicative effectiveness. At the same time, if you deviate too much from what is conventional, then your processing of the discourse is going to be much harder. And there have been studies that show that if an expert or very advanced learner of English, for example, or a native speaker of English reads a text and there's collocational inaccuracies in there, you slow down because you're not expecting it. Because it's those chunks, the phraseology, that makes discourse predictable, and that helps you process the language. There's this link between, you can only process the content of discourse well if you are very familiar with the packaging, the language code. And part of the language code, of course, is the phraseology. That a fluent reader has good knowledge of phraseology. A fluent listener has good knowledge of phraseology. But if the phraseology deviates from what you are used to, then it's going to kind of distract you at least. And so it's always a matter of striking a balance between the focus on accuracy and convention and the focus on expressiveness. And this applies also to the discussion about creativity, right? And so I think if as a reader, you are kind of, there's a signal that there's going to be a creative metaphor, like it's a bit like, and then you expect, aha, there's going to be a creative metaphor. But if it's not kind of introduced in a way like that, then you're kind of thrown, right? And so it's all about of kind of strategic use of these means that we have in our repertoire. And it's a matter of balancing, I think. But in terms of telling language teachers, please don't be obsessed with accuracy all the time, especially because things change all the time. What used to be mistakes when I was a high school student are no longer mistakes now. Language is dynamic, it changes. And so the same thing for grammar, right? So so-called grammar mistakes in my days are no longer mistakes now. And so, yeah, you have to kind of be aware that language is a changing dynamic thing, and that actually a focus on accuracy only is not very helpful for your students. Unfortunately, you have those high-stakes tests and exams, and so we teach to the test. We want to make sure that our students get good grades in those tests. And so that's what we refer to as the backwash effect or the washback effect. If you don't change the exam system or the test system, it's very difficult to change the teaching system. And that's one of the big problems in places like China, where the high-stakes tests to get into university, for example, are still multiple choice tests. And so when I teach international students from China, and I tell them about my research about multiple choice exercise, they say, well, that's all fine, Frank, but I can't change the system in China. The parents of my students want me to prepare them for those multiple choice tests. And so nothing changes. And all I can say, please start a revolution. But they won't. We are fighting against the system after all. Eh? And the system won't listen to research.
Well, thank you very much. Lots of takeaways for you, today.